Hello, my name is Ian Dean. I am the creator of MeshBaker, which is a suite of tools for Unity 3D for combining many meshes into a single mesh and texture used by those meshes into atlases. Why would you want to do that? Performance. In Unity, one of the best ways to improve performance is to reduce draw calls. Each mesh requires its own draw call, so combining them will reduce draw calls. So in this scene we can see, in some ways it's not the best scene because there's 12 draw calls and 6 of them are already being saved by Unity's dynamic batching. However, dynamic batching isn't the best approach because every single frame Unity has to collect these meshes and build them into a bigger mesh. So it's more efficient to bake them together into one mesh ahead of time, and then Unity doesn't have to do that work on every single frame. So let's get started. At the core of MeshBaker are two components, the Texture Baker and the MeshBaker. So first I will show you how to use the MeshBaker to quickly combine meshes that all use the same material, and then I'll show you a few tricks that can do, and then we'll show you how to combine meshes that use different materials using the Texture Baker. Now, to make this as simple as possible and show nothing magic is going on, I'm going to just create a MeshBaker by creating an empty game object and just adding the MeshBaker script to it. So I've just added this mb3 underscore MeshBaker script to this empty game object. Now let's add some of the meshes in this scene to that. So let's pick the 3 red cubes. They all use the same material. So I add these 3 red cubes and I click bake, and what happened is a new object was created in the scene, this combined mesh, game object mesh, and if I look at its child, there's a MeshRenerer under there with a new mesh filter on it, and it has uses the same material. If I go over to my scene, now that I've got that selected, you can see that it's that new mesh is a copy of the original dice, and there it is. The original dice are still in the scene, so we're getting extra draw calls. So I can either delete them, or I can go back to my MeshBaker that I created and click Disable Renderers on Source Objects, and that hides them in the scene, but they're still there in case I want to move something and rebake. So that's great. One thing about the mesh that was created is that mesh is just an instance of a mesh in this scene. It's not an asset. So if I were to try to save this as a prefab, that the mesh in the MeshRenerer here would be missing. So how do I go about fixing that? Well, if I go back to the my MeshBaker and output bake into scene object, if I switch that to bake into prefab, now a new field shows up, combined mesh prefab. So I have to give it a prefab here. So let's create a prefab. That'll do. Now that prefab has to be a game object in order to drag it to this field. So where's that field? See, it won't let me drag this new prefab into this field. It has to be game object. So what I have to do is create a game object. Oh, do I have the right one? Yeah. And I drag that game object into my new prefab. Now I can go back to my MeshBaker. Let's rename this to MeshBaker. And I'll drag my new prefab into that combined mesh prefab field. Now I click bake, and that there's a mesh that was created that's an asset. So I could, to show you what's going on, I can delete this combined mesh out of the scene. I can drag that new prefab in, and there it is. And did that work right? Let me just repeat that to make sure it was gone. Why are those red dice still there? The MeshRenerers are disabled. Oh, because that's prefab is already in the scene. So let's delete it out. So it's gone, and I can drag this prefab in, and there is the that's a prefab. So I can use that in other scenes. Now, one other quick trick I would like to show you is you can also bake these dice into a skinned mesh. So let's bake back into scene object, switch the renderer field to skinned mesh, and click bake. And now the cool thing about this is we still only get one draw call. So if I come over here, see that that's still just one object. If I disable it, does all three dice disappear. However, the dice can be moved independently. In fact, it looks just like the original dice. So that's a very cool trick that you can do with MeshBaker. Is sometimes you have a pile of, say, 100 objects, and you want those objects all to move independently. They're all very simple meshes, so that would be 100 draw calls, which is quite expensive in Unity. But by baking them into a skinned mesh, you get one draw call, although you do introduce the overhead of the skinned mesh. So it's worth a little bit of analysis, but usually you would be ahead trading 100 draw calls for one skinned mesh. So now we'll go on and show you how to combine meshes that use different materials.